The desert sun had already begun to fade, casting long, golden streaks across the dusty horizon of Dry Creek Town, a place where fortunes were made, lives were lost, and compassion was a word few remembered. The air hung heavy with the scent of sweat, whiskey, and horse leather. Men moved through streets like shadows of greed and survival, each carrying the same hollow stare of those who'd buried too much and loved too little. At the edge of the marketplace, a wooden platform stood crooked, draped with a tattered red cloth. It was auction day, not for cattle or horses, but for people. The whispers said an Apache girl was being sold, caught by bounty hunters who'd found her half dead near the borderlands. They said she was barely alive, beaten, starved, and scarred beyond repair. The going price, they joked, was $2, the price of a half-empty bottle of rye whiskey. When they dragged her out, silence fell. She was no more than 19, her frame thin and trembling beneath a torn buckskin dress. Her dark hair hung in matted ropes, her face caked in dust and blood. Her wrists bore the raw imprint of chains, her shoulders marked by the cruel lashes of a whip. There was nothing left of pride or fight, just the faint rise and fall of her chest that proved she still breathed. The auctioneer spat in the dirt and laughed bitterly. "Ain't worth much, boys," he called. "But she can still work if she don't die first. $2, and she's yours." No one moved. Even the drunkest gambler turned away. In a town where strength meant survival, a broken soul was worth less than a bullet. Men muttered curses, the sound of boots scuffing the dry earth filling the silence where bids should have been. But near the back of the crowd stood Elias Boone, a man who rarely spoke and never smiled. He was a lonely cowboy, a drifter who had ridden into Dry Creek 3 days earlier after selling a small herd of cattle. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and sun-worn, his hat pulled low to hide the sadness etched into his eyes. Elias lived on the outskirts of the world, preferring the company of wind and dust over people. He hadn't planned to stop. He hadn't planned to care. But as he watched that fragile girl sway under the weight of her own body, something deep within him stirred, a memory he'd tried to bury long ago. He had seen too many broken things in his life, burned homes, lifeless children, dreams crushed by war. And now, in that dying girl, he saw something he recognized, the quiet will to survive, no matter how small it burned. The auctioneer shrugged. "No takers. Then she'll be dumped with the others behind the stables." $2. The voice cut through the air like a whip. Heads turned. Elias Boone stepped forward, the coins glinting between his calloused fingers. No one laughed. The man's eyes were cold, and his tone made it clear he wasn't joking. The auctioneer blinked, then smirked and pocketed the coins. "Yours, cowboy. But don't say I didn't warn you. She's more trouble than worth." Elias didn't answer. He just took the rope tied around the girl's wrists and walked away, the sound of his boots echoing against the hollow silence. The crowd dispersed, muttering about the fool who'd spent money on a dying slave. By the time Elias reached his horse, the girl had collapsed once more, her knees buckling under her. For a moment, he stood there, unsure. He had no plan, only a feeling that leaving her there would make him something worse than the men he despised. He lifted her gently, placing her across his saddle like fragile glass. Her breath was shallow, but steady. The mark of the whip had crusted over in dark streaks, and her skin was hot with fever. As he mounted, he looked once at the town fading behind him, its greed, its cruelty, and then turned his horse toward the endless stretch of open land. The desert wind followed them, carrying away the last sound of Dry Creek. For the first time in years, Elias Boone didn't ride alone. That night, under a blanket of stars, he built a small campfire near a dry riverbed. He laid the girl beside it, wrapping her in his spare blanket. She didn't speak or open her eyes. The firelight flickered across her bruised skin, revealing the story of every blow she had endured. She was little more than a ghost of a human being, but she was alive, Elias poured a small cup of water, wetting her lips. She stirred faintly, her body trembling at the touch of cool liquid. He sat there for a long while, staring into the fire, listening to the lonely crackle of burning wood. He had no words, no comfort to give. Only silence, and the unspoken promise that she was safe for tonight. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote howled. Elias looked up at the stars and wondered what kind of man he'd become. A savior, a fool, or just another lost soul clinging to something broken, because it made him feel less alone. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. The girl's breathing steadied, slow but strong. Elias leaned back, pulling his hat low over his eyes. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking of leaving at sunrise. He was thinking of staying. Because sometimes, the loneliest hearts don't find love. They build it from the ruins of what the world throws away. The dawn broke slowly over the empty plains, the horizon painted in pale streaks of gold and gray. The night had been long and cold, filled with the whispers of wind and the faint crackle of dying firewood. Elias Boone sat motionless beside the ashes of the campfire, his eyes fixed on the fragile figure lying beneath his blanket. The girl still breathed, though her breaths were shallow, each one a quiet war between life and death. He had seen death many times before, on battlefields, in mining camps, in the eyes of men who had given up. But something about this girl's struggle struck deeper than he expected. She had every reason to die, yet something in her spirit refused to. She clung to life with the silent desperation of someone who had lost everything, but refused to let go of existence itself. Elias spent the morning gathering what little he could find. Wild herbs, rainwater pooled in the crevices of rock, a few scraps of dried meat from his saddlebag. He wasn't a doctor, but life on the frontier had taught him how to mend wounds and fight fever. Slowly, carefully, he cleaned the cuts on her arms, the whip marks that ran across her back, and the raw bruises that marred her skin. The Apache girl didn't wake, but she flinched faintly under his touch, her body instinctively recoiling from the kindness she didn't understand. By midday, the sun was high and relentless. Elias led his horse toward the river a few miles east, filling his canteen and returning to find the girl still alive, though weak as ever. He decided to move her. There was a small shack he owned near the foothills of Red Mesa, a place he hadn't visited in nearly a year. It wasn't much, just a cabin built from hand, cut timber and stone. And that was shelter, and that was something worth miles of pain. The journey took 2 days. Each night, he built a small fire, kept her warm, and gave her sips of water. She never spoke, not even in dreams. Her silence was eerie, heavy, like a blanket of unspoken sorrow that filled the space between them. Elias began to wonder what horrors she had endured before he found her. By the time they reached the cabin, her color had begun to return. She could sit up with help, her eyes fluttering open once in a while. Dark, wary eyes that carried more years of pain than her body should have lived. Elias didn't expect gratitude, and she gave none. She simply existed in the quiet rhythm of healing, eating small bits of food, drinking water, and sleeping long hours that turned days into blurred fragments of recovery. As the weeks passed, Elias repaired the cabin, patched the roof, cut new logs for the fire, and fixed the broken door hinges. He worked in silence, his movements steady and deliberate, the way of a man who had lived too long with ghosts. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where she came from. He knew enough about the world to understand that not all stories needed to be told aloud. But one thing became clear. The girl was not ordinary. When she began to walk again, slowly and painfully, she moved with the quiet grace of someone used to the wilderness. Her eyes followed every sound, every shadow. She could spot a bird before it took flight, hear a coyote's cry before it echoed. She was part of the land in a way no settler could ever be. Elias started leaving food for her on a small wooden table by the fire. Beans, bread, jerky. She would eat only when he wasn't looking, as if the act of accepting help was a shame she couldn't bear. Sometimes he'd return from chopping wood to find her standing by the river, her gaze lost in the reflection of the water, her face unreadable. He didn't know her story, but he could sense it. A story written in scars, in the way she flinched at sudden movement, in the way she never let herself sit with her back uncovered. She had known captivity. She had known cruelty. And yet, beneath the weight of all that pain, there was something unbroken. A quiet defiance, a fire that refused to die. One evening, the wind carried the smell of rain again, and Elias found himself sitting on the porch, watching lightning dance across the far hills. Inside, the girl slept by the fire, her breathing calm and even. He realized, with an ache he didn't understand, that the silence no longer felt empty. It felt shared. He remembered a time long ago, a small homestead, a wife, a child. Both gone now, claimed by fever and war. He had buried them with his own hands, and walked away from everything afterward. Since then, he had lived without purpose, wandering from one lonely town to another. But now, for the first time in years, he felt the faint pull of belonging. Not to a place, but to the fragile life he'd pulled back from death's grip. As days turned into weeks, she began to move more freely, gathering herbs, tending the fire, cleaning the small cabin. She still hadn't spoken a single word, but her actions said enough. Each small gesture, fetching water, leaving a portion of food for him, mending a torn shirt, spoke of gratitude too deep for words. The townsfolk didn't come near the cabin. They whispered about the strange cowboy who had bought an Apache slave. Some said he'd gone mad. Others said he was cursed. Elias didn't care. He'd seen what those same people did to anything they didn't understand. The town had cast her aside. To them, she was worth $2 and nothing more. But to him, she had become something precious. Proof that even the most broken lives could be mended. Winter crept over the land slowly. The nights grew colder, the days shorter. The girl, stronger now, began to venture farther from the cabin, leaving small trails of footprints in the snow. Elias often watched her from a distance, wondering what she saw in the wilderness that kept her eyes searching the horizon. Perhaps she was looking for something she'd lost. A home, a tribe, a memory. Then one morning, he woke to find her gone. Her blanket lay neatly folded by the fire, her tracks leading east toward the open plains. He felt no anger, only a hollow ache. Maybe she had found the strength to leave. Maybe she needed to. He saddled his horse and followed the tracks until they disappeared near the edge of the canyon, where the wind had swept them away. He waited there for a long time, the cold biting into his hands, staring out at the endless desert below. Somewhere in that vast emptiness, she was walking free, and that, he thought, was enough. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, he saw movement in the distance. A lone figure walking back toward him, slow but steady. The girl had returned. And this time, she was holding something in her hand. A small carved talisman made of bone and wood. She placed it by the cabin door, a silent offering. Elias didn't understand its meaning, but he didn't need to. Some bonds, he realized, didn't need words. They were built in quiet moments, in survival shared between two lost souls. And in that cold twilight, something unspoken began to grow between them. Not love yet, but the fragile seed of family. The snow had melted into muddy rivulets that carved shallow paths through the valley. Winter had passed, leaving the land raw and open again, its silence broken only by the sigh of the wind and the distant cry of crows circling above. The cabin stood weathered but strong, smoke curling lazily from the chimney as if it too had learned to breathe again. Inside, the faint rhythm of life had returned. The Apache girl, now stronger, her wounds faded to pale scars, moved about with quiet precision. She tended the fire, gathered herbs, and fetched water from the stream. Her silence was no longer that of fear but of habit. Like a language she had chosen to keep. She had begun to find purpose again, not through words, but through the rhythm of survival. Elias Boone had changed too. The loneliness that once weighed him down had softened. He still rode into the hills each morning to check his small herd of cattle, but his return now held meaning. There was someone waiting, not as a lover or servant, but as another soul bound to his. The cabin had become something neither of them had known in years, a home. But the peace of the frontier was fragile, and word, like wildfire, never died quietly in places like Dry Creek. Rumors had begun to drift back to town, that the quiet cowboy who rarely spoke had taken in an Apache woman, a slave he'd bought for $2. Some said he'd gone mad, that she would kill him in his sleep. Others whispered that he was harboring an enemy, a spy from the tribes who still burned settlements at the edge of the desert. To the men of Dry Creek, hatred came easier than mercy. And when whiskey mixed with fear, it became poison. One afternoon, Elias rode into town for supplies. The moment his boots hit the ground, eyes followed him from the saloon porch to the general store. Conversations stopped, and the air grew thick with judgment. He didn't react. He never did. He loaded his supplies, flour, ammunition, salt, and was nearly done when he heard it. Someone spat his name behind him, followed by a low curse. The men at the saloon laughed, cruel and hollow. They called him Apache lover, slave keeper, traitor. Elias didn't turn around. He had lived long enough to know that pride could cost more than peace. But not everyone in Dry Creek had forgotten cruelty. Among the drunk and bitter crowd was Jed Crow, a man who had made his fortune on blood, selling bounty contracts, hunting Apache families for government coin. Years ago, he had ridden with a band of mercenaries that burned villages across the Rio borderlands. To him, the Apache girl Elias had saved was nothing more than unfinished business. When he heard that she was alive and living free, a spark of vengeance flared in him. He watched Elias from the porch, eyes narrow beneath the brim of his hat. He knew men like Boone, quiet ones who thought they could walk away from the world's cruelty. Jed had no patience for that kind of man. The frontier to him was about dominance, ownership, fear, and the thought of a once captured Apache woman being treated as family burned him like fire. As Elias rode away that evening, Jed Crow made a promise to himself. He would find the girl. He would take back what he believed belonged to him, or make sure she didn't live to defy him again. Back at the cabin, the days passed quietly. The girl, who had slowly begun to find her strength again, moved through the land as if she belonged to it. She gathered sage and willow bark, teaching herself to live as she once had before men's cruelty tore her world apart. She still hadn't spoken to Elias, but there was understanding in every glance they shared. When he mended fences, she worked beside him. When he rode out to gather cattle, she waited at dusk with firelight ready, and stew simmering on the stove. There was no need for words. They existed in a world built on gestures, on trust, on unspoken gratitude. Then, one night, the peace broke. The wind carried the faint sound of horses, 3, maybe 4, moving through the darkness. Elias had learned to listen to silence. It was the language of survival. He stood from the porch, rifle in hand, eyes fixed on the tree line. The horses stopped just beyond sight. The night went still. He didn't light a lantern. He didn't move. Only the low flicker of the fire inside the cabin glowed faintly through the shutters. At dawn, he found boot prints in the mud near the stream. Men's boots, not from town folk who hunted or traded. These were heavy, spurred, the kind carried by men who came for violence. That day, Elias worked quietly, his mind calculating. He said nothing to the girl, but she must have sensed it. Her eyes followed him closely, and when he checked his rifle twice, she understood what that meant. She began packing dried food into small pouches, preparing for something she could feel but not see. The next few days passed in tension. The calm before something dark. Elias knew Crow's type, men who didn't let go of hatred. He had seen enough to know this wouldn't end with words. And one cold evening, his fears were confirmed. A gunshot echoed through the valley, shattering the silence. The horses panicked. Elias dropped his tools and ran to the cabin. The girl was crouched by the fire, wide-eyed but calm. Another shot cracked through the air, splintering wood from the doorframe. He pulled her down behind the stone hearth, listening. Voices came from the trees. 3 men, maybe more. Laughter, low and cruel. Jed Crow's voice cut through them like a blade. They were coming for her. The night stretched long and breathless. The men didn't attack immediately. They wanted fear to do its work first. The girl trembled, her body rigid as if the ghosts of her past had returned to life. Elias could see it in her eyes. The terror of captivity, the nightmare of chains. But this time, she wasn't alone. When the final shout came and footsteps charged toward the cabin, Elias was already waiting by the door. The rifle cracked once, twice, echoing into the canyon. The men fell back, cursing and firing blindly into the dark. The girl stayed hidden, clutching the carved talisman she had once left by the door, whispering something ancient under her breath. When silence returned, only the sound of wind and distant hooves remained. The men had retreated, but not far. Elias knew this was only the beginning. The cabin had become more than a shelter now. It was a line in the dust between mercy and vengeance, between 2 lives trying to heal and a world determined to break them apart. And as the fire burned low that night, Elias sat awake, rifle in his lap, his gaze fixed on the stars beyond the window. The girl slept nearby, her breath slow and steady. He knew the peace they had built had just turned into a battlefield, and when the sun rose over Red Mesa again, both of them would have to fight for the life they had begun to call family. The morning came heavy with the scent of gunpowder and rain. The sky above Red Mesa was gray and bruised, the kind of dawn that warned of trouble before it showed its face. The ground around the cabin was marked with boot prints and scattered shells, the grim remains of the midnight attack. Elias Boone stood in the yard, rifle slung across his shoulder, eyes scanning the horizon. He'd seen enough ambushes in his life to know that silence never lasted long. The men who came last night hadn't meant to kill. They had meant to terrify, to remind him that the world hadn't forgotten what he'd done. Buying a broken Apache girl for $2 might have been an act of mercy in his eyes, but to the men of Dry Creek, it was a challenge to their hate. Inside the cabin, the girl worked quietly by the fire. Her face was calm, but her movements carried a tremor she couldn't hide. The memory of captivity lived deep in her bones. Every shot, every shot was a shadow dragging her back into that darkness. But now, there was something different about her. She didn't shrink from fear anymore. She stood tall, moving with quiet control, as if determined never to be powerless again. Elias knew the men would come back. Jed Crow was not the kind of man to leave a fight unfinished. He was a predator, driven by greed, cruelty, and pride. He would return, and this time, he wouldn't just bring guns, he'd bring vengeance. Elias spent the morning preparing. He reinforced the cabin's walls, laid fresh traps along the tree line, and checked every bullet he owned. He didn't speak a word. He didn't need to. The girl watched him silently, her dark eyes following every movement. When he finished, she handed him a small leather pouch. Her herbs, medicines, and roots she'd gathered through the months. It was her way of preparing too. For hours, the wind howled through the valley, carrying the cries of distant crows. The land felt haunted, alive with tension. Elias couldn't shake the feeling that this fight wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about redemption. He thought about the years he had spent drifting across the frontier, running from his past, from the graves he'd left behind. He'd lost his wife, his child, and his reason for living. He had carried guilt like a saddle strapped to his soul. But when he found that girl in Dry Creek, beaten, broken, left to die, something inside him shifted. Saving her had given him back a part of himself he thought was gone. Now, the thought of losing her ignited something fierce in him. Not love, Not yet. But a promise. A vow to protect the only life that had reminded him he still had one. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky blood crimson over the mesas. The sound of horses came again, faint at first, then growing louder. Elias took position on the porch, rifle in hand, his heart steady. The girl stood at the window, her eyes reflecting the glow of the fire. They came in a line, 6 riders this time, armed and confident, led by Jed Crow. The man rode at the front, his long coat flapping in the wind, his face carved from cruelty. He was older than Elias but twice as ruthless, his eyes burning with the kind of hate that could only be born from power unchecked. The riders stopped at the edge of the clearing. There were no words exchanged, no warnings. The moment stretched thin, silent, until Crow raised his rifle. The first shot shattered the quiet. Elias answered it instantly. His bullet struck true, catching one of the men square in the chest. Chaos erupted. Gunfire, the scream of horses, the sharp echo of metal against wood. The cabin shook with the violence of it. Bullets tore through the walls, sending splinters flying. The girl crouched low, gripping the rifle Elias had left her days before. Her hands shook at first, but instinct took over. She had hunted before, long before captivity stole her freedom. Now, she fought for it. She fired once through the narrow window, the recoil driving her back, but the shot found its mark. A man fell. The battle raged for minutes that felt like hours. Smoke filled the cabin, mingling with the scent of blood and sweat. Elias moved with practiced calm, every shot deliberate, every breath measured. He wasn't fighting for glory. He was fighting for peace. When the last echo faded, the clearing was still. The ground was littered with bodies, the snow around them stained red. Only 2 horses remained standing, one riderless, the other carrying Jed Crow, wounded but alive. Crow glared at the cabin, rage and disbelief burning in his eyes. Elias watched from the porch as the man turned his horse and fled into the hills. He could have shot him then, ended it. But something held him back. Killing Crow would end the fight, but it wouldn't end hate that had created it. The land itself was sick with it, poisoned by greed and prejudice. When the last hoofbeat faded into the distance, Elias lowered his rifle. The girl stepped out beside him, her breath visible in the cold air. Her face was expressionless, but her eyes told a story of relief and exhaustion. Together, they stood in silence, watching the horizon. The night that followed was long and still. Elias buried the bodies at dawn, marking their graves with stones. The girl helped in without a word. They didn't mourn their enemies, but they didn't rejoice either. Death was a familiar visitor in the frontier. It needed no celebration. When it was done, Elias sat on the porch, cleaning his rifle. The girl sat beside him, holding the carved talisman she'd once placed by the door. She tied it to the post beside him, letting it hang in the morning wind. It was a symbol of survival, of unity, of defiance against a world that tried to break them both. But as the sun rose higher, Elias knew this peace would not last. Jed Crow was still out there, nursing his wound and his hatred. He would return, not just for revenge, but for pride. And next time, he wouldn't come alone. Elias looked out over the valley, the wind carrying the scent of rain once more. The blood on the horizon was only the beginning. The spring wind rolled across the wide plains, warm and restless, carrying with it the faint promise of rain. The snow had vanished from the hills, replaced by wild grass and yellow blooms that danced in the sunlight. The land looked alive again, but beneath its beauty, something darker stirred. 2 months had passed since the night Elias Boone and the Apache girl defended their cabin from Jed Crow's men. The land had grown quiet again, and the days had fallen into a rhythm of fragile peace. The girl, once frail and fearful, had grown stronger. Her body bore scars, but her spirit was alive again. She had begun to walk freely across the land, tending to the small herd, hunting rabbits, gathering wild roots. Elias watched her often from the porch, silently amazed by how far she had come. She no longer looked like the broken soul he had bought for $2. She looked like something reborn. A woman of strength and silence, forged by pain but unbroken by it. In her movements, there was pride again. The bond between them had deepened, built not on words, but on shared survival. Elias had found in her something he hadn't known he needed. A reminder that even the most shattered hearts could still rebuild themselves. They were two lost spirits bound not by blood, but by a quiet sense of belonging. Yet far beyond the peaceful valley, hatred was gathering again. Jed Crow had not died that night. He had limped his way back to Dry Creek, wounded and half mad with fury. The bullet Elias had put through his shoulder had festered, leaving him weakened and humiliated, but his pride, twisted and cruel, burned hotter than ever. Crow had spent the past weeks recruiting. He went from saloon to saloon, buying drinks and whispering poison into the ears of desperate men. He told them a story of betrayal, that a cowboy was harboring a savage, that the Apache girl had killed white men, that Boone was protecting her for gold or worse. His lies found eager ears among men who needed a reason to hate. By the time summer's heat began to settle on the land, Jed Crow had gathered 12 armed riders, drifters, bounty hunters, and outlaws hungry for blood or coin. He promised them a reward for bringing back the girl and killing Boone. When Elias noticed the first signs, a broken fence line, distant hoofprints in the sand, he knew trouble had returned. The calm days that followed only deepened the unease. The girl felt it too. She had become attuned to the land's moods, and now the world itself felt tense waiting. One evening, as the sun sank behind the mesas, Elias sat by the porch sharpening his knife, his rifle leaning beside him. The girl sat by the fire inside, weaving a small mat of straw and reed. The stillness between them was familiar, but under it lay something heavier, an unspoken knowledge that the peace they had built would soon be tested again. At dawn, the attack came. It began with smoke. A column rising from the southern ridge, their old barn, set aflame. Elias mounted his horse and rode out to the edge of the property, his heart hard as stone. He saw them then, riders coming fast through the dust, 12 figures silhouetted against the morning sun. At their front was Jed Crow, face twisted in rage, his bandaged arm hanging limp but his rifle steady. Elias turned his horse and galloped back to the cabin. The girl was already waiting, bow in hand, her movements calm and certain. Together they moved like two parts of the same instinct, him loading rifles, her preparing arrows and herbs, both wordless, both ready. The first shots tore through the air, splintering wood and sending echoes across the valley. Elias returned fire, steady and deliberate. The girl moved to the side window, firing arrows with precision born of survival. The sound of battle filled the land. Gunfire, hooves, shouts. They fought from dawn to dusk. Dust and smoke mingled in the air until the whole world seemed to spin in chaos. One by one, Crow's men fell. The girl fought fiercely, her aim true, her fear replaced by something fierce and primal. Elias fought with the calm of a man who had nothing left to lose. But the enemy was too many. By sunset, the cabin was half ruined, its walls riddled with holes. Elias had taken a wound in his arm, blood soaked his sleeve. The girl, though unharmed, was exhausted, her breath ragged. As the light faded, Crow's men drew back to regroup. They had lost half their number, but they weren't done. Crow himself stood at the ridge, his face shadowed by hate. He shouted to his men, his voice carrying across the valley, promising gold and vengeance. That night, Elias and the girl prepared for what they both knew would be the final fight. He built a small barricade inside the cabin, setting traps and loading every weapon he had left. The girl, silent as ever, gathered herbs and made poultices for his wound. Outside, thunder rolled over the horizon. The storm came just before dawn, rain pelting the ground as lightning split the sky. The wind howled through the canyon, drowning the sound of the approaching riders. Then came the final charge. Through the storm, Crow and his men descended on the cabin, shouting curses lost in the wind. Elias met them with fire and fury, his rifle flashing in the darkness. The girl fought beside him, her arrows flying true, her spirit burning as bright as the lightning above. One by one, the riders fell. The rain turned the earth to mud, blood mixing with water in dark streams. Elias's world narrowed to noise, pain and motion, until at last, he saw Crow. The man stumbled through the storm, his gun raised, his face twisted in hatred. Elias's rifle was empty, his knife slick with blood. Crow charged, but before he could fire, an arrow pierced his chest, driving him backward into the mud. The girl stood behind him, bow in hand, her eyes steady. The storm howled, drowning all sound as Crow's body sank to the earth. His hate ended there, swallowed by the rain. When morning came, the land was quiet again. The storm had passed, leaving only the smell of wet earth and gunpowder. The cabin still stood, damaged, scarred, but standing. Elias sat on the porch, his arm bound, his eyes on the horizon. The girl sat beside him, silent as always, but her presence spoke louder than any word could. The danger was gone, but the weight of what they had endured hung heavy in the air. For the first time, Elias understood that they had both earned something more than survival. They had earned peace. Yet, as the sky brightened, he knew that the world would never truly leave them alone. There would always be others who hated what they couldn't understand. Still, for now, they had won. And for two souls who had started as strangers, one broken, one lost, that was enough. The storm had passed. The land lay quiet beneath a pale morning sky, washed clean by rain and blood. The cabin, once a refuge built by a lonely cowboy, now stood as a fortress scarred by violence. Its wooden walls bore the marks of bullets. Its roof sagged from storm water, and the yard was littered with the remnants of battle. But it was still standing, and so were they. Elias Boone awoke to the soft warmth of sunlight filtering through the cracked window. His arm ached, the bandages stiff with dried blood. The smell of smoke lingered faintly in the air, mingling with the scent of wet earth and pine. For a long moment, he lay still, listening to the silence that had replaced the thunder of gunfire. The Apache girl was already awake. She sat by the fire, her movements slow and deliberate as she tended to a pot of boiling water. She had cleaned the cabin, buried the dead where the land met the creek, and patched what she could. Her face was tired, streaked with dirt, but her eyes carried a calm Elias had never seen before. Outside, the world looked reborn. The valley shimmered under the morning sun, the river swollen and glinting like polished glass. Birds had returned, their songs weaving through the quiet. It was as if nature itself had come to cleanse the horror of the night. Elias rose from his chair and stepped onto the porch. His boots sank into the wet earth. He gazed out toward the ridge where Jed Crow and his men had fallen. The rain had washed away the blood, leaving only dark patches of turned soil. There was no trace of their cruelty now, only peace. He felt no triumph, only exhaustion. The fight had cost him much, and though he had defended his home, something deep within him had changed. Violence no longer felt like survival, it felt like a burden. The girl had seen enough of it for a lifetime. So had he. Days passed. Slowly, life returned to rhythm. The animals were rounded up again, the fences repaired. Elias's arm healed beneath the care of the girl's herbal poultices. Her skill with medicine had saved him more than once, and he wondered how many times she had done the same for others before being sold like an object. She was different now. The fear that once shadowed her eyes had vanished. She moved through the land as if it belonged to her again. Sometimes Elias watched her stand on the hill at sunset, her hair catching the golden light, her face turned toward the horizon. She had begun to hum softly. Songs he didn't know, songs that seemed older than the hills themselves. He realized, in those quiet moments, that she was no longer the beaten slave he had bought for $2. She was free. Not because he had freed her, but because she had reclaimed herself. Elias built a small corral near the creek, a place to raise colts and break them gently. The girl began tending a small garden beside the cabin, planting beans, corn, and herbs. Together they worked the land, side by side, without words. Their bond was not of blood or law, it was of shared solitude, forged in struggle and quiet understanding. The nearest town heard whispers of what had happened out at Boone's ranch. Some called him a hero. Others said he was mad for living with an Apache woman. But Elias stopped caring long ago about the opinions of men who lived behind bar counters. He had seen what hatred could do, and he wanted no part of it. One afternoon, as the sun set behind Red Mesa, Elias found himself standing beside the small wooden crosses he had built over the graves of Crow's men. He had buried them himself, not out of mercy, but out of duty to the land. Even the wicked deserved to be returned to the earth. The girl joined him there, her steps light, her gaze steady. She carried a single feather, bright red, tipped with black. Without a word, she placed it at the base of one of the crosses. It was a symbol of release, of letting go of vengeance, Elias understood. From that day on, something subtle but profound changed between them. Where once there had been distance, now there was quiet companionship. The loneliness that had haunted Elias for years began to fade, replaced by a sense of belonging he hadn't thought possible. Seasons turned. The land bloomed again. The girl's garden grew tall and green, and Elias's herd flourished. Travelers passing through sometimes caught sight of them. A broad-shouldered cowboy and a silent Apache woman working side by side in the fading light. Some whispered stories about them, half in awe, half in disbelief. But the truth of it was simple. They had become family, not through words or law, but through the unspoken bond that only the broken could understand. Years later, when the war between settlers and tribes raged far beyond the valley, Elias stayed where he was. He built a new roof, raised more fences, and grew old beneath the same wide sky. The girl, no longer a girl, but a woman hardened by survival and softened by peace, remained with him. She spoke little, but her presence filled the silence with meaning. When travelers stopped by for shelter or food, they found kindness at Boone's cabin. The Apache woman offered them meals, herbs for wounds, and quiet comfort. Some recognized her as the one who had once been sold in Dry Creek for $2. They whispered of her beauty, her strength, her mystery. But none dared to speak cruelly. Something about her eyes silenced mockery. Elias aged, his hair turning to silver, but his spirit remained steady. On the evenings when the sun sank low over Red Mesa, he would sit beside her on the porch, watching the light fade. They rarely spoke, but they didn't need to. The world had tried to break them both, and yet here they sat, alive, together, at peace. When the end came for Elias, it came softly. He passed in his sleep one spring morning, the air rich with the smell of rain and new blossoms. The girl buried him beneath the old oak tree overlooking the creek, marking his grave with a single wooden cross. For many years after, travelers still passed through that valley. Some spoke of a quiet woman who lived alone by the creek, guarding a small farm and tending a grave. Others swore they saw her walking at dawn, standing by the hill as the sun rose, always looking east where the sky burned red over the mesas. Time washed over the land like wind over stone. The cabin aged, the fences faded. But the legend of the lonely cowboy and the $2 Apache slave endured. It became a story told in hushed voices around campfires, of a man who chose compassion over cruelty, and a woman who found her freedom not through revenge, but through love and dignity. And though no one knew where her path finally led, the people said that when the wind howls across Red Mesa at night, you can still hear her song, soft, ancient, and full of peace.